Hello, I'm Carl Grossman. Here in New York City, in the building over there, the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, there's been an absolutely super important conference today on the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, nuclear power in general, and also the implications of the Fukushima disaster for nuclear power in the United States. The panelists, articulate, couldn't be more articulate, included the former Prime Minister, Naoto Kan of Japan, who was the Prime Minister during the beginnings, it's still going on, the beginnings of the Fukushima disaster. Peter Bradford, who was a member of the NRC, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Arnie Gunderson, a nuclear engineer and an executive of a major company in the nuclear industry who has now become a major critic of nuclear power, and Ralph Nader, the legendary consumer activist. Dr. Gregory Jaczko was the chairman of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission when the Fukushima disaster began, and he pleaded with the NRC to take seriously the lessons of Fukushima, which the NRC wasn't taking seriously. Dr. Jaczko was, and because of his great concern about the safety of nuclear power as a result of the Fukushima catastrophe, and his articulating that, his voicing those concerns before the NRC, he was pushed out as NRC chairman, pushed out of the NRC.
Our next speaker is Dr. Gregory Jaczko. Dr. Jaczko is former chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He was first sworn in as a commissioner of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, on January 21, 2005. On May 13, 2009, President Obama designated him the organization's chairman. During the Fukushima crisis, Chairman Jaczko recommended that Americans evacuate 50 miles outside Fukushima. On February 9, 2012, Dr. Jaczko cast the lone dissenting vote on plans to build the first new nuclear power plant in more than 30 years, when the NRC voted 4-1 to allow Atlanta-based Southern Company to build and operate 2 new nuclear power reactors at its existing Vogtle nuclear power plant in Georgia. Dr. Jaczko cited safety concerns stemming from Japan's 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, stating, quote, "I cannot support issuing this license as if Fukushima never happened." His pro-safety stance caused much friction with his fellow commissioners, resulting in his departure from the NRC. He has since been appointed to a post on a congressional panel overseeing the National Nuclear Security Administration. Please welcome Dr. Gregory Jaczko.
Well, thank you for that warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to all of you about my thoughts on the Fukushima accident and what I think is the legacy of nuclear accidents in general in Japan, the United States, and throughout the rest of the world. When the accident began, it began with an earthquake followed by a tsunami that struck off the coast of Japan on March 11th, 2011. At the time, I was at home just waking up, and I got a phone call from the NRC Operations Center saying that there had been an earthquake in Japan, and there was a tsunami warning and tsunami alert at that time. The first thought that the NRC focused on, that I focused on, was what kind of impact this tsunami could have on plants on the west coast of the United States. There were forecasts of a potential for a low or small tsunami to reach the west coast. So we monitored the plants. and all of the activities related to the tsunami with those plants on the West Coast. Thankfully, the impacts were minimal, and there was not ultimately any impact to those plants. At the same time in Japan, there were really two crises unfolding. The first was a tremendous humanitarian challenge with the people who were directly impacted from the earthquake and the tsunami. I was part of discussions focusing on the nuclear issue, but became privy to discussions and activities on the part of the US government to help assist with the humanitarian efforts to deal with the tragedy from the tsunami on the West Coast. In the beginning part, the first day of this incident, there were very few people who anticipated or expected that weeks, months later, we would see one of the most significant nuclear reactor accidents in history. And perhaps more importantly, one of the most significant nuclear accidents involving technology that was closely associated with technology here used in the United States, and ultimately that came from the United States. So it was in the context of this tremendous humanitarian crisis that these issues began to develop. For the next 9 months, a period of time that I think is unprecedented in the studies, analysis, and models that are done about nuclear power plant accidents, the Fukushima reactors continue to be fundamentally in an accident condition. Normally, when a nuclear power plant shuts down or the nuclear reaction turns off, systems turn on to cool the reactor fuel and prevent it from having a significant accident. At the Fukushima Daiichi site, those systems failed. So for the next 9 months, the nuclear fuel would be too hot and would release significant amounts of radiation. As time went on, the radiation decreased as the fuel became cooler. And ultimately, in December of 2011, I had the pleasure and the opportunity to go to Japan and meet with many of the colleagues that I worked with closely in the Japanese government and talk to them about the success in bringing that reactor under control and ending ultimately the accident. But at that time, we talked about the fact that this was just the beginning of the cleanup work that would take decades to complete. So when we think about this accident, it's important to keep in mind many of the myths about nuclear power that the accident challenged. And there were many, many significant myths that were challenged. The most probably important was the myth that I think had developed here in the United States, that had developed throughout the world with people in principle who use technology different from Soviet or Russian reactor technology. And there was a myth that had developed that accidents would not happen, in particular severe accidents, would not happen in these reactor types. You would never see an accident progress beyond a minimal release of radiation contained within the nuclear reactor buildings that are designed to do that. And in fact, at the NRC, we would annually conduct exercises to simulate these reactor accidents. And there was always discussions about how complicated and convoluted we had to make these scenarios to actually ever get to an accident or to a simulated release that we could then test the emergency response capabilities. Of course, Mother Nature has a way of confounding all of us and came up with a very simple way at Fukushima. So that first myth of accidents never happening was challenged. And not only was it challenged once, but it was challenged 3 times. 3 reactors ultimately underwent severe accidents at the Fukushima site. A number, again, that was very unusual and unexpected to see a single reactor site have 3 reactors simultaneously undergoing a severe accident. As we look at the accident and what happened, one of the next important myths that was challenged was that any release of radiation would be small and would be contained within the reactor buildings and the containment structures that were designed specifically to do that. Of course, that was not the case at the Fukushima Daiichi site, and one of the reasons was because of the hydrogen explosions that occurred early on in the accident. Again, an area that many had believed had been properly addressed and properly dealt with, so that even if there was an accident that became serious, the impacts of hydrogen would not lead to the kinds of explosions that we're seeing. Of course, this was an issue, and perhaps Peter Bradford will talk more about it. This was an issue that developed at 3 Mile Island. As the fuel melt began, ultimately there was an accumulation of hydrogen in the containment building at the 3 Mile Island site. So for decades, this has been a known phenomenon. Systems were put in place, procedures were developed, and methodologies were established to ensure that in the event of an accident, a hydrogen explosion would not occur. So again, a myth and a belief that was challenged. Another that was significantly confronted, and again was a legacy of the 3 Mile Island accident, was that we had understood finally how to properly conduct emergency plans and implement emergency plans and conduct emergency evacuations. Clearly, the accident in Fukushima showed that those plans are never as simple to implement as they appear to be, and that unique challenges always occur, which make those even more difficult to implement in reality than we can ever imagine. And finally, as Prime Minister Khan touched on, we shattered the myth that we fully understand all the natural hazards that can impact nuclear power plants, not only in Japan, but of course throughout the world. When we think about this accident then, it's important to keep in mind the personal human toll that the accident has taken. The immediate aftermath, as I said, of the tsunami and the earthquake had a tremendous impact on tens of thousands of people. Lives were lost, people went missing. So you add to that then the stress and anxiety of now having to confront, after all of the water has receded back into the sea, to now confront the difficult challenges over the next several weeks of dealing with the evacuations of over 100,000 people. Now, stepping aside from those difficult challenges that we have a hard time measuring, there are real measurable impacts from the accident at Fukushima Daiichi. There is the significant land contamination and the economic impact that has occurred in Japan. 30% of the country's electricity is not available in the usual manner because of the shutdown of all of the nuclear power plants as a result of the accident. And an estimate that was done in 2012 by an independent organization, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, they concluded in their report, and this is a direct quote, that the current rough estimate of the total cost to Japan from the Fukushima Daiichi accident is about $500 billion US. And this is perhaps the most important piece of this statement, which will substantially increase if nuclear electricity generation continues to be replaced for a long time by other means. And of course, that's the situation now that is happening in Japan. So $500 billion is the minimum cost and impact of this accident in Japan. So what does all of this tell us, and what does it ultimately mean? First and foremost, we have to recognize what it's telling us, that severe accidents can and most likely will happen at some point. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, maybe not in 30 years, but they will happen. There will be ways that Mother Nature, that human mistakes and errors will lead to these kinds of severe accidents at nuclear power plants. But moreover, what this accident is telling us is that society does not accept the consequences from these severe accidents. Society does not ultimately find it acceptable to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people, to have areas of land be permanently contaminated, to spend close to $500 billion or more to deal with the aftermath of an accident at a facility that is simply designed to generate electricity. So what this accident fundamentally should be telling us is that for nuclear power plants to be considered safe, nuclear power plants should not produce accidents like this. And by should not, I don't mean that they have a low probability or that they have a very little likelihood or that they have a 1 in 10 million year probability. I mean simply that they should not be able to produce accidents like this. That is what the public has said quite clearly after the Fukushima accident, And that is, I think, quite clearly what we need to use as a new safety standard for nuclear power going forward. Now, at the NRC, during the accident, the NRC came up with a number of recommendations of areas that needed to be improved. And at the time of the accident, I was asked in many scenarios, in many situations, what did I think of the safety of nuclear power plants? Based on the standards and the regulations of the NRC at the time, I said a very simple thing. I said, based on those standards and what we know and what our regulations are today, the majority of plants are operating safely. They're operating within those limits. And I made a very important addition to that. And I said, but if we need and we identify areas and challenges and things that need to be fixed, then we will make sure that we implement those recommendations, that we implement those lessons. And about 3 months after the accident, the staff at the NRC conducted a very, very thorough and authoritative assessment of the weaknesses within our own system. And an analysis that they conducted in about 3 months, which has really stood the test of time. And I think it's a real testament to the people who worked on that and conducted this work. And they essentially came up with 12 high-level recommendations. And there were a number of things in there, like ensuring that we update our regulations for station blackout, that we look at seismic events, we look at flooding events, we look at natural hazards, we look at our emergency response plans. We consider not only the potential for one reactor at a site to have an accident, but the potential for all the reactors at the site to have an accident. They identified issues related to controlling hydrogen, a problem that had thought to have been solved previously. They looked at the need to have better instrumentation on spent fuel pools so that there was not uncertainty, like we saw at the Fukushima Daiichi accident about the condition of the Unit 4 spent fuel pool. So they went through the process of identifying these recommendations and did a tremendously thorough job. But the challenge isn't to identify the lessons. The challenge is ultimately to implement those. And it is unfortunately, I think, in that area where significant weaknesses and shortcomings remain. And I'm going to give you an example of 3 issues. 3 of these very significant, perhaps some of the most significant lessons that were learned from the Fukushima Daiichi accident, and talk to you about where those lessons are today. The first is the seismic reevaluations that are being done for nuclear power plants in this country. The incident at the Fukushima Daiichi site was fundamentally an earthquake which created a tsunami. To this day, it's unclear exactly how much the earthquake or the tsunami contributed. Clearly, we know the tsunami had a tremendous effect, but there may in fact have been impacts from the earthquake itself. So you would think that this is an issue, and especially given the earthquake that we saw in Virginia, this is an issue that would get the utmost attention from a technologically sophisticated industry. But when I was chairman at the NRC, one of the complaints I heard from the industry repeatedly was that there were not enough experts to go back and reassess and reanalyze the seismic impacts on nuclear power plants. Well, my first thinking was, shouldn't we have been doing this all along? Why all of a sudden now do we have to hire all these people to now go on and conduct these assessments and these analyses? Why isn't this something that was being done on a routine and regular basis? Unfortunately, it wasn't. So the latest plan for implementing modifications and taking the best available science about seismic events and how they affect nuclear power plants is to essentially put off this work for another 6 or 7 years. Now, the truly sophisticated assessments, the best way to understand how seismic events can affect a nuclear power plant, some of those assessments won't even be done until 2020, let alone the plant modifications that could come out of this. Now, I bring this up because this should have been one of the most highest priority issues that should have been completed from the post-Fukushima lessons learned. And at the time, when I was chairman, I challenged the industry. I said, we should set a goal. We should all be able to agree on a simple goal. Let's implement all of these lessons within 5 years. No industry wants to spend the next 10 years or more dealing with an accident and the ramifications from an accident that happened in 2011. And I challenge the industry to do that. Unfortunately, that challenge will not be met. There's almost no way that on one of the most important issues, the modifications to plants will be made within 5 years for all the facilities. And I think that's just simply unacceptable. Let's take another issue, station blackout, which was known to be the most significant impact from the tsunami and the earthquake at the Fukushima site. When that happened, all the electrical power distribution systems were lost, and the ability to cool the reactors was essentially completely disabled. The NRC is looking to update its regulations and its requirements, again, a process for just updating the regulations that won't be done until sometime in 2016, more than 5 years after the accident in Fukushima. And this was identified as the most crucial issue coming out of the accident, was the ability to better deal with station blackout events and this complete loss of electrical power distribution within the system. Now, just taking one other issue, an issue that throughout the rest of the world, including in Japan, has become an obvious issue and an obvious area that currently operating plants need to address, the so-called filtering of hardened vents. The Commission outright rejected making requirements to filter events on nuclear power plants. And essentially what this means is in the event of an accident, when pressure has to be released to reduce the impact from the accident, that the material that's released would be scrubbed of radioactive contamination, a way to further reduce the contamination around the site and to people off-site from the reactor. So unfortunately, what we see is a process in which delay continues to be used instead of actual solutions to problems from an industry that claims it is incredibly technologically advanced, that it is incredibly focused on safety. The time that it will take to try and fully implement these lessons is simply staggering, and I think something that is completely unacceptable. But so let's look at where we are in the United States and in Japan today. At Fukushima Daiichi, there continues to be challenges with cleanup and water management at the site. As Prime Minister Khan talked about, there's an issue with groundwater contamination. So while the immediate accident is over, the challenges from this accident continue. And I think to some extent, the good thing that has come out of some of the recent reports and the recent contamination events has been a renewed focus on this tragedy in Japan. A renewed focus on the need to have sufficient and exhaustive oversight of the utility, TEPCO, that not only created the accident, but ultimately has the responsibility to clean it up. The government has stepped in to provide more resources to ultimately deal with these issues, but make no mistake that they will not be easily solved. For any of you who've ever had a home or lived in an apartment that had water leaks, you know water has a way of finding its way into almost anything. And water will find its way into the reactor site for some time, and as long as there's a significant source of contamination there, that will ultimately lead to continued contamination of the sea and the groundwater around the site. But ultimately, the international credibility of the Japanese nuclear industry is at stake, and with that, the credibility of the Japanese economy as a whole. But there will be, for decades, a cleanup activity at the site at Fukushima. There will be the water management issues. There will be the removal of spent fuel pool. There will be decontamination of communities in the hopes that some people may be able to return to their communities. But after years and years and years, it's hard for a community to be brought back together. There will be the removal of the melted fuel, or perhaps the inability to remove the fuel and the need to simply leave it in place. And then ultimately, some type of decommissioning of these reactors, a process that will take probably my entire life to finally be completed. This is a significant challenge, and one that cannot be forgotten and cannot be lost. In the United States, when we think about the future, I'm reminded of a speech that I gave many years ago in which I talked about the future of nuclear power. And at the time, I proposed that there were two futures. There was a future in which there was a thriving industry because safety truly became the #1 priority for the industry. because they looked at novel and new ways to deal with severe accidents, to reduce not only the possibility, but to completely eliminate the possibility of severe accidents. That the management of spent fuel in the long term had been solved and resolved, and the industry was able to move forward in a thriving way with a new generation of bright young people willing to pursue this technology because it truly was beneficial. The other alternative was a future in which the industry would be declining, where the focus would be more on decommissioning and trying to sustain an industry in which people no longer saw it had a future, and the best and brightest no longer went in to pursue this technology and pursued other alternatives. This is a future in which a few plants may be built, but those plants wouldn't necessarily have the kind of support they need to operate efficiently and effectively because the industry would slowly be turning to other areas. Ultimately, I felt it was up to the industry to decide which path that they were going to follow. And I think if you look today, the future is clearly on that second path. It is clearly on an industry that is declining. But with that comes tremendous challenges. With that comes the need to have a greater emphasis and a greater focus on safety than ever before. Because as the industry contracts and as resources get more constrained and more challenged, it becomes even more imperative to continue to ensure that these plants that are out there now continue to operate without having a severe accident like the one that we saw. So ultimately, when we look to the future, I think we have to recognize the challenges with nuclear power. There are promises from nuclear power, but there certainly are challenges. And I think we have to recognize that we should challenge ourselves to do better, that this is an expensive technology that always has the risk for these kinds of severe accidents. And we have to ask ourselves if we cannot do better, if we cannot figure out a better way in 10, 20, or 30 years to generate electricity. I believe we can. I believe in this country, when we present ourselves with these kinds of challenges, we're able to meet them. And so as we look to the future, I'm reminded of the country that invented the light bulb. I think we can do better. We can invent a new way to power those light bulbs. We can invent a new way to light our homes and provide for all our electronic devices that are such a necessity for us these days in a way that doesn't pose the risk of severe contamination of land around nuclear power plants or the displacement of hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people from their homes for an extended period of time. That, to me, is the future that I think we should be striving for and one that I think we can meet. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jaczko, thank you.
I know these were speeches, presentations, but what speeches, what presentations on the most important of issues, the lethal dangers of nuclear power. Thank you for watching.